Federal prosecutors continue to build their case against Jeffrey Epstein's alleged sex trafficking ring. The 66-year-old self-proclaimed billionaire has pleaded not guilty to several sex crimes. He's accused of sexually abusing dozens of underage girls as young as 14.
Epstein has faced sex crime allegations for more than a decade. The hedge fund manager accepted a secret plea deal in 2008 that forced him to register as a sex offender. Mola Lenghi takes a closer look.
The alleged behavior shocks the conscience.
The newly unsealed indictment alleges Jeffrey Epstein started abusing underage girls in 2002 with alleged encounters at his New York City mansion and Palm Beach estate. According to prosecutors, victims were initially recruited to provide massages to Epstein, which would be performed nude or partially nude, and typically include one or more sex acts.
The girls were recruited in a variety of ways, usually by employees of Epstein and sometimes by fellow victims. The victims typically received hundreds of dollars in cash.
Over the weekend, federal agents forced their way into Epstein's $77 million New York City townhouse. You can see the damage to the door. During their search, investigators say they discovered at least hundreds and perhaps thousands of sexually suggestive photographs. Some were allegedly in a locked safe containing compact discs with handwritten labels such as "Girl Pics Nude." Epstein pleaded guilty to sex abuse in 2008. Then U.S. Attorney Alex Acosta negotiated a secret plea deal with Epstein's attorneys that required the former investment banker to register as a sex offender and serve 13 months in a Florida county jail. Today, Acosta works as President Trump's Secretary of Labor. Acosta defended the plea deal during an April budget hearing.
The facts in this case were presented to a grand jury that actually recommended a charge that would have carried no jail time at all. And at the end of
making this deal in secret?
And at the end of the day,
do you regret making this deal in secret?
Congresswoman, if I could finish, if at the end of the day, Mr. Epstein went to jail.
Over the years, Epstein's established relationships included President Trump and former President Bill Clinton, who rode Epstein's private jet in the early 2000s. His spokesman said the trips were related to work with the Clinton Foundation, adding, President Clinton knows nothing about the terrible crimes Jeffrey Epstein pleaded guilty to in Florida some years ago, or those with which he has been recently charged in New York. He's not spoken to Epstein in well over a decade. Attorney David Boyce represents 3 of Epstein's alleged victims.
They hope that Mr. Epstein and the people who worked with him and enabled him are finally brought to justice. And this looks like an important first step in having that happen.
So Mola Lenghi is with us now from just outside of Epstein's home in New York City. And as I understand it, it's one of the largest private residences in Manhattan. So Mola, we saw in your story that Epstein had already been charged for sex crimes in Florida. So I think a lot of people are wondering how he's able, and he served time. People are wondering how he was able to be charged again in this case here in New York.
Well, Anne-Marie, federal prosecutors with the Southern District of New York say that the deal that Epstein and his attorneys reached in the Southern District of Florida with federal prosecutors there was just that. It was a deal with the federal prosecutors in Florida, and that it does not apply to alleged crimes that he committed in the state of New York, only to the crimes that he confessed to in Florida. Obviously, this is a point of contention. Epstein's legal team is pushing back on this, saying that no, that was a federal immunity deal, that it should be applied universally and globally to all jurisdictions in the United States. So this is really shaping up to be the point of contention in this case, and it will likely be the point of litigation, at least where most of the litigation will focus on this case moving forward.
And Mola, now that the authorities have raided his New York townhouse, do we expect more charges to surface?
It's possible, Vlad. It's possible that more charges could surface. As we mentioned, evidence was found in the home, according to investigators. Images, a trove of images of young women, CDs with images of young women. But perhaps more significantly, as I've been told by experts, more significantly than some of the evidence that was found in there is if more victims come forward. We know that since Epstein's arrest, Federal prosecutors say more victims have come forward. The FBI is calling for more victims to come forward. And it could be especially damaging if victims who have stories, who have cases against Epstein that happened after his immunity deal in Florida, after he served time. So if there are alleged cases to have happened, in the last 9 years after he served time in Florida, that could be especially damaging. One point that federal prosecutors made in the hearing yesterday was that even after Epstein served his time in Florida, that he has sort of continued this predatory lifestyle. That he has continued, that lifestyle of pursuing young women and the images that they found and that sort of thing. Just, if nothing else, based on the evidence that they found inside the home, they said it was exactly the way that many victims described. The massage table that was set up in a room was exactly the way that it was described 10, 15 years ago. It was still like that today. So if victims come forward with news stories that have happened after he pleaded guilty in Florida, after he served time in Florida, that could be especially damaging to Epstein's case.
Yeah, definitely, because the Florida case was based on things that happened in the early 2000s, the early aughts. And, we had Ricky Kleeman here yesterday, Mola, and one of the things that she sort of floated, one of the questions she floated was about the statute of limitations on trafficking. But if there are more recent cases, then that would not apply. I also wonder if the fact that he pled guilty in Florida will have an impact on the case here. But what we do know is that there are most likely dozens of victims. Only a handful have been identified thus far. Do we know how they're reacting to the news of these new charges being filed against him?
Well, the victims that we have heard from, they're encouraged by the new charges and the fact that federal prosecutors here in New York are pursuing Epstein on these new charges. One victim said that the news of Epstein's arrest is a step in the right direction to bringing Epstein to justice, holding him accountable for his crimes. She said that it has restored her faith that justice can be applied to the powerful and that money cannot triumph over justice. Another praised the federal prosecutors here in New York for finally, paying the appropriate attention to this case and that, it's being pursued in a serious way, the way that she put it. So there certainly seems to be a sense that, perhaps an opportunity was missed in Florida 10 years ago, 11 years ago now, and that this is a chance to make it right.
All right, Mola, thank you very much.